Hey guys, you're listening to the Wise Words Book Club, where we scale down some of the best non-fiction books and we give you their key ideas. We teach you how to apply them to the real world and how to benefit from them. So if you're looking to improve or looking to grow, then why not listen to some wise words? Words that make you wise.
So today we're going to be discussing Factfulness. It's a book that me and you have both read probably, I don't know, maybe a year ago, 2 years ago. I don't even know how long it's been out, to be honest.
Something like that.
And it was something that we both really enjoyed at the time, but we didn't really quite grasp why it was important, or we did, but it just wasn't maybe so relevant to our lives. But now with obviously the coronavirus and the Black Lives Matter movement, etc., it's kind of become more and more interesting and relevant to maybe the world that we're living in now. So, I mean, there's 10 instincts talked about in the book. I don't know if you wanted to start with one of those, or if you just wanted to start with like a.
Yeah, I think I'll start with just as overall point of so his introduction to the whole book is basically about our worldview and how we perceive the world and how it's currently it's never updated. And so if we ever try to make a decision or a guess or a choice about anything, we're using outdated knowledge. And so the idea is that you need to update this knowledge, because until you do, everything's going to be inaccurate and you're not going to get the most accurate answer that you're looking for. And that's why he talks about these 10 instincts, because how to make it the most accurate way to look at something, how to assess information and be able to apply it properly.
So he gives us the 10 instincts that are sort of almost holding us back, right? And he's like, these are the thought processes or the instincts that you have when you initially hear information, which are just basically going to skewer your worldview to something that isn't exactly correct.
Yeah.
I think one of the most revealing things, like you're saying at the very introduction, he basically offers, I think it is in the intro actually, he does like a test. I think it's 10 questions or something.
Yeah.
And he's basically got the statistics of all the people he's given this test to, because he always starts his presentations with tests, and he's been talking to like UN sort of world leaders, scientists, etc. And he's found out that actually chimps do better on the test
Yeah.
in general.
Just do multiple choice.
Which is absolutely mental. And I think he talks about this idea that you wouldn't use a GPS in your car, right? In the wrong city. So obviously we live in Bristol. It's like me using the GPS for London and then trying to drive around. But he claims that's what the policymakers and politicians are doing when they try and solve problems with the wrong facts. And he's like, how could this many people be that ignorant? And then he tries to explain why obviously these people are also wrong. And don't get me wrong, it's not just the elites almost. The people who are so supposedly intelligent is actually everybody. Like nobody in general really outperforms these chimpanzees. And I think one of his main theses wasn't even the fact that it's because we're all dumb. It's not that. It's because we are weighing up the wrong things and we're focusing on the wrong areas.
And the fact that these are called 10 instincts are basically it assumes that this is natural. This is the way you would look at things. This is how our brains are programmed. But the thing is that instead of
It wasn't programmed for truth, right?
Yeah.
That's the way I think of it. We're not programmed for truth. We're programmed for sort of cooperation and almost like jumping to conclusions, I think, as Daniel Kahneman put it.
Exactly. So it's not whether you're stupid or not if you don't know the literacy rates of the population. Yeah. But it's just that it would be so outdated because we made this judgment ages ago when we had outdated knowledge. And so the whole idea is we need to update that so that then we can make these be aware of these 10 instincts. And the first one he talks about is the gap instinct. So he talks a lot about we have a very binary way of looking at things. It's either left or right, or in this case, it's rich and poor, or the West and the East.
Or the developed and undeveloped, I think, is his famous example.
Yes,
in my head,
yeah, exactly. And the problem is that when you look at things on such a spectrum, when you don't look at things on a spectrum, but you look at just the extremes, you miss everything in the middle. You're only looking at the very extreme examples. Yet realistically, not everyone's an incredible poverty and an uber billionaire. It's not the case.
Yeah, sure. I feel like when you compare the poorest of the poor to the rich of the rich, of course there's a massive gap. But you're looking at the two extremes, right?
Yeah.
And I think his main point is what you're just saying. It's the middle is actually a lot bigger than you think. Like there's a lot of overlap in the middle. A lot of people are in the middle, so you should actually be comparing most people in the middle to maybe the extreme at the top and maybe the extreme at the bottom, right? That's where the comparison should be made. Um, yeah, I thought it was really interesting.
Well, the thing is that you can't if I take the most extreme example of the rich and the most extreme example of the poor, if I try to get an average, okay, that it will just be the middle, and the middle is not a representative of the average, because there could be, three-quarters of the world more towards the rich area than the poor area. Yet if I take the middle as the average, then it's going to be inaccurate.
I think another thing he was talking about is just like averages give you some sort of idea of where where the sort of middle of this sort of spectrum is, but they're not the be all end all.
Yeah.
Because like you're just saying, right, you could have 10 people sat in a room. What's the average net worth? If there's one billionaire in there, the whole thing's skewed completely to yeah. So yeah, it's just interesting. What for me is more like people don't really think. It's just like we just take these sort of numbers, averages, or this gap, and we just immediately think, right, it's unjust, it's unfair.
We just assume that's the case. And but the thing is that we're overlooking so many examples in the middle of it, and like we are creatures that love novel information, and the most novel information is like memorable information, things that are outside the norm. And so in this case, you're normally going to remember someone who's got $10 billion over a guy that's got $10 million, because it's more extreme.
But yeah, and we're also forming the wrong comparisons, right? So we're comparing like a billionaire with some starving family in Africa, let's say, right? We're comparing this massive injustice, when in reality that's not really the comparison group, really, is it? In my head,
Yeah, yeah,
um,
exactly. And so what thing is like the way he says that we should look at the world is through four income levels. That we split it into four, not just the rich and the poor, but break it down and then what each income level means. Did you take much away from them?
well, in terms of the four income levels,
Yeah,
to be honest, I thought it was really interesting to understand that. Like, I think he talks about level four being anybody over like $36 a day. I think it could be a bit more than that, but that's like the majority of everybody in the West. So basically, I think what I took away was this idea of absolute poverty v relative poverty. Like we see people in the US, the UK, and we think, oh, they're poor, but in reality, that's relative poverty because they still have things that people in absolute poverty don't. We're talking here like water. We're talking here like the ability to feed themselves, etc. Right?
yeah,
Um, and I just thought it's just mental how we're still so skewed in the idea of undeveloped and developed worlds, when in reality the majority of the stuff we call underdeveloped or undeveloped worlds are actually almost at the same level as the developed now.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and it's back to what you said. Like people don't we learn all this stuff in school, but the thing is, you're learning. I thought that's the phrase I was telling you about. I coined it. It's like snapshot thinking. You've taken a snapshot in time, and then you've just pretended that snapshot's still relevant now. It's like taking a picture of you as a kid and then say, like almost extrapolating from that picture and saying that's me now, right? Things are always changing, so why are we still using the same old ideas that back in the day maybe they were undeveloped nations, and like when we were learning in school they were underdeveloped, right? But stuff changes quick.
but yeah, exactly, and like look at our parents. Our parents are perfect examples of this, where they will generalize about something that like China is a third world country, like back in
Yeah.
the '60s or whatever. But obviously, so much has changed since then. But people could make assumptions to just assume that, like, and make choices regarding that information, and it's so outdated. Um, yeah,
This level of outdating is yeah. I guess the argument is people are quite lazy. They don't really want to have to update their knowledge all the time. But kind of, I reckon one of the main points in this entire book was uh, the only way to know things and actually be sort of factful, as he puts it, is to be consistently updating it.
I wonder if it's related to the sort of Dunning Kruger effect in regards to, like, most of these people, they have, like, they don't think about this stuff all the time realistically. The population of a certain country, the literacy rates, those kinds of things. So if they have like one answer, then that makes them more confident in it, and so they just assume that it hasn't changed, or they don't ever
Yeah.
question it because it's just something that they don't think about much. So it's not it, like it's not to mean that they're stupid or anything like that. It's just the fact that they're more confident in it, and so they don't question these things.
Uh,
Um,
I think this has brought up a really relevant point as well, mate. It's this is in my head, right? So, what is the main source of information for people, right? In terms of the world, okay? What is the main? It's the media, right? The news
Yeah,
media,
yeah, yeah,
and they never cover progress. They're always covering problems. So, um, what one of his points was is if you don't update your knowledge, it blinds you to like all the transformations happening around the world, and of course you're blinded to the transformations that are happening around the world when all you see is like wars. You see famine in like for example, I think it's in Yemen now. There's a famine going on, right?
yeah,
Um, and that's all you ever see. So you always just think, oh wow, these guys are really bloody struggling. Like nothing good's happening in the world. And I think one of his interesting points was like, this is going to go on to another instinct. It was I think it's the size instinct, and it's the idea that if you get given a number, you need to put that number in perspective. So he was like, okay, there's about 4.1 million babies that died in I can't remember what country it was, right? And then he was like, but what you should be asking is like, what was that statistic 10 years ago? And what is that statistic in comparison to the population? And apparently what it was is that was the death rate of babies, obviously. And that is 3% of the population, whereas before it was 15% over the course of 10 years. So it sounds like a really high number, but progress has been made. And there's no news story going, oh, wow, in 10 years, the death of babies has gone down 12%. It's always just like, oh, 4.1 million babies died. What a travesty. Without explaining the fact that it's got better.
If a report is trying to grab our attention and something isn't very interesting, realistically, they're going to try to make it more important or try to make it like overvalue it so that we overvalue it so that it actually
Sure.
grabs our attention. And that's a perfect example in like the size instinct, because it's like if you leave a number by itself, it has nothing to compare it to.
Mm-hmm.
You can't, like you said, if you're comparing it to 10 years ago, 4.1 million to 5 million is very different, but you wouldn't know that if you didn't have another number to compare it to. The comparison gives something its actual value, but without it, we overvalue it.
Well, it gives it a meaning, right? Because you can put it in perspective. What does it mean, right? A number by itself doesn't mean anything.
We just have to accept its face value.
Yeah, you might be like, oh wow, that sounds like a lot. Like it does. 4.1 million babies. Obviously, that's an absolute travesty, isn't it? That's a very large number. But if you look at the change, it's decreasing and it's getting better.
Yeah,
And it's like I don't know if you're ever going to get to this point where it's going to be perfect, right? Because stuff happens that's outside of our control. But at the same time, it's like the problem is with the media because obviously you never hear these progress stories because it's not news. Good
yeah,
news is not news. Bad news is always news. What we now have is this like idea that everything is way more. He talks about it like the over dramatic worldview, where everybody sees everything as more dramatic than it actually is, and the news is just creating these gaps or creating these exceptional or it covers exceptional events and makes it look like that's the norm, whereas the norm is inherently boring. I was having this discussion with my sister earlier who was doing history, and I was just like, well, history is just all the exceptional. Like in history, all you study is wars. You don't study the day to day living, which is why that book you're reading on habits is quite interesting of the past or the day routine of
yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
past, because that's actually what normal life was like, not the exceptional bits.
Yeah, no, exactly. There wasn't a war every single day. Well, there
Yeah.
probably was at some points, but yeah. And the thing is that you know, like we're talking about progression, obviously reporting has gotten better. There's more access to coverage and everything like that, which gives the illusion that the world is getting worse because you can see more of it. But realistically, things can be bad but are getting better. I think that's one of his like sort of quotes in it. Things can be bad
Mm.
but they can be getting better. You know, um, and it's so true. Like you can see. Um, I don't know, a problem in the world, but if you were to go back 20 years ago, 30 years ago, how would it compare? Would it be better? And I think realistically it would in some aspects. Obviously, this isn't the given for everything. Um,
Oh, that you just really reminded me of something. That was a really, really interesting point he made about global warming slash climate change and how the US was blaming China based on their total emissions. Okay, and it's the same with India. They were like, right, your country are producing the most amount of total emissions. Okay, and obviously that sounds really bad, but then you realize what's their population. Okay, and what his point was, if you divide the total emissions by the population per person, they are emitting less carbon dioxide than America, and basically America penning this all of them with the biggest total, but the total doesn't amount when it's of such obviously a vast population.
yeah,
Um, and I just never thought of it that way, and it makes a lot of sense that it should be measured per person rather than as a total nation. Because obviously, if like you got a really small country and it's producing absolutely tons per person, then obviously they're not doing it very efficiently, right? If you kind of get me.
England's probably
Um,
terrible in that regard.
Oh, yeah, I would have thought so. It'd be interesting
Realistically.
to see, but once again, it's a bit like the GDP. Well, actually, GDP is per person, isn't it? Per capita, sorry. But like, if the measurement isn't done per person, it's not actually that useful.
Yeah.
Because obviously, you could say like a disproportionate amount of people are producing something. If you kind of get me, or I don't know. It's once again, numbers aren't the truth. It's just a way of trying to sort of view a problem.
Yeah, well, like thing is, like you can't take everything from just numbers. You need to look at the context that the numbers are talking about. You know, because the context is what matters. Otherwise, you end up overlooking it and just making generalized statements.
Hmm. I think I liked his idea. So he says like when you see a lonely number in a news report, you should ask yourself a few questions. So what should this number be compared to? What was this number a couple of years ago, 10 years ago? What is it? What is this number in a comparable country or region? And what should it be divided by? I.e., should it be divided by the population, etc.
Yeah,
Because I thought it was quite interesting. It's like it's the same with like let's just say they report there's been an increase in crime. But are they taking that from a specific location? Or what are they comparing it to? Last year, are they comparing it to 10 years ago? Right?
it needs to be specific.
Yeah. And I feel like we always panic. Oh wow, the crime rate went up 1% this year. But if you look at the overall trajectory, it's gone up. It's gone down 10% over 10 years, right? And it's a bit like the stock market. It's not going to be clean. It's not just going to be going up all the time. It's up and down, up and down, up and down. But as long as the trajectory is right, this is back to like it can be bad, but be getting better. Like obviously the crime rate's still bad if it's still happening, but it could be getting better.
Yeah, no, exactly. Exactly. Perfect example. I think like that he talks about this in like the negative instinct, um, where we actually have a problem of like comparing things to the past because we forget the past. And when we end up when we're approached with bad news or when bad news is alerted to us, what we end up doing is not thinking rationally. We end up thinking emotionally. You know, our amygdala is triggered. And so what happens is because of that, we're not thinking about the past. Okay. So the only thing is like we're thinking about this current event and we have nothing to compare it to. And so it seems much worse than it actually is.
Sure.
But we need to be able to remain rational and like be able to think about the past and see whether it's better. You know, if there was a reduce in dentistry hygiene this year, we could go back 250 years ago and say, well, you know, it's much better. But that's the thing. It's like we don't ever when we're approached with bad news, we don't look into the past to compare.
Once again, numbers in my head, numbers aren't sexy, but like weird dramatic events are sexy, and that's the problem. Um, Bad events are always the thing that reach us because that's what we're scared of. Almost is like
Yeah.
gets attention because that's what the fear-based reality almost.
Well, it goes through our filter, and like thing is that it also anchors us to it. Like, you know, if we haven't come across a certain thing that the news is reporting, then that's our anchor to it. That's our first piece of information about that kind of event. And if it's negative, which most of the time it is on the news, then, you know, we're going to have a negative perspective of something rather than looking at the whole picture. What do you take away from the fear instinct then?
So the fear instinct was very similar in my head to the negativity. It's more this idea of we're being we're being manipulated kind of in a way from the media because of we're really our attention is really drawn to what we're fearful of. Um, so this is what one of the things he said. It says the image of a dangerous world has never been broadcast more effectively than it is now, or the world has never been less violent and more safe. So fears that once helped keep our ancestors alive today help keep journalists employed. I like that. It's just so true. Um,
It really is.
so he talks about the type of fears that were always covered in the news, right? So one of them is physical harm. So violence caused by people, animals, sharp objects, or nature. So that's everything from domestic, oh, well, like, in fact, I was going to say domestic abuse, but terrorist attacks, bear attacks, shark attacks, tornadoes, earthquakes, right? That's the physical harm. That's what we're scared of. That always gets covered. Captivity, so loss of control, loss of freedom. Think about some of the movements at the moment. It's all about the idea that our freedoms are being limited, etc., which in some cases they are, but don't get me wrong, but it's always about this loss of it, so feeling
Yeah.
captive. Then this is idea of contamination, so invisible substances that can infect or poison us. Talk about like all the research into pesticides, etc., stuff like that, vaccines, and people still don't have made their mind up on these sort of issues, right? And the whole point there is to scare us to think, oh wow, like is that actually bad? And kind of, I quite like one of his points was like, we are really scared of like this idea of chemicals in food, but in reality, everything's a chemical because everything's molecular, deep down. And his argument is like at the end of the day, it's all about the dosage.
Yeah.
So, like, if you drink 10 gallons of water, you're going to die. Um, it's just, and it's the same for these kind of like so-called poisonous pesticides, etc. I'm sure, obviously, over the course of a lifetime, eating it again and again and again does damage. But what I'm saying is, it takes a big dose of it to actually really hit you. And we're
Yeah.
so scared of these things which are minute and have been shown to cause damage, but in reality don't actually cause as much damage as you think. Which is another interesting point he made. But that's back to the fear thing. So it's always about like death. It's always about physical harm. It's about, yeah.
Yeah, I think because, so for instance, like bad information, or like bad events, they're threats, and threats are like loss. We're about to lose something. So if we're about to like, if we apply this to like loss aversion, so loss aversion meaning that like,
We're more sensitive to losses than we are sensitive to gains.
yeah, exactly. And so if we have this, then basically it goes through our filter. We're much more sensitive to it. We're much more sensitive to than say like someone had a good day at work today. You know, you're not going to really bat an eye about that. And so what happens is, because this actually gets through our filter rather than this guy had a good day at work, it means it becomes the norm. And so we assume that this stuff is recurring all the time. You know, that like, terrorist attacks are happening all the time because, we've heard about a couple of them. Um, and that's the thing. It's like we associate bad things or things that we hear on the news because it gets through our attention filter, and then we project that as if it's the norm, when realistically it's very much not, because you're not seeing everything else that is going on. If a plane crashes, like I remember when the Malaysian Airlines flight went down, and then there were like three flights in 1 month that went down or something, because I was over in Australia at the time, and naturally you start to think like, fucking hell, air travel's like really dangerous. Oh my goodness, like so many things have like crashed. The next flight I get on, how safe is it? All these things, because you just assuming that it's becoming the norm, when realistically, air travel's safer than car travel.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, I think the statistics in the book he talked about with air travel was like 0.00000 like 25%. It was something ridiculous where you see it and you're just like, wow, if that's really the sort of fatalities from air travel, then yeah, don't get in a car. Um, I think another interesting point based on this was what I said to you before this is the frightening and dangerous being two different things. So
mm,
something frightening is something that poses a perceived risk. So something that isn't really actually a risk to you, but it's a perceived one, right? And something dangerous poses a real risk. But what happens with the news is we paying too much attention to what's frightening rather than what's dangerous. So my example, this would be what's frightening, right? An earthquake, a shark attack, a bear attack, something exceptional, a terrorist attack, for example. What's actually dangerous, right? Overeating, dying through diabetes or obesity, smoking. These are dangerous. They pose real risks.
well, I think he has a formula for risk, which is like what risk equals danger times exposure. It's like whether you're exposed to it or not. Yes, like shark attacks are bad, but unless you're going into the water every single day where there are sharks, then you're not really exposed to it.
Yes, it's almost like why extreme sports are actually dangerous. It's because
Yeah,
the more exposure you have, it's a bit like climbing Everest, right? You can climb it as many times as you want, apart from the time when you fall down and die. So
yeah,
like
exactly.
each time you expose yourself to it, like it's like playing Russian roulette. I think that's like with 6 bullets. You wouldn't play it 6 times, would you? Because you're obviously guaranteed to die. So actually, no, I don't think that's true, is it?
Maybe not, but you've got fucking good luck otherwise.
Yeah. Um,
But yeah, fear basically gives the illusion that it's dangerous, where that's not always the case. You have to take it into consideration, like how exposed you are to it.
mhm. um, I'm trying to think what. So we've covered fear, negativity. Because
The straight line. Do you want to?
yeah, the straight line. I think the straight line's quite interesting. It's the idea that we, with for example, I think his example in the book, sorry, was about population growth. It was we tend to think we see like a straight line going up in terms of the population growing year on year, and we just think it's going to continue like that forever. But then he poses the idea that what's actually happening to the population at the moment is there are more, as you would call, underdeveloped countries, which are actually becoming more developed now anyway. So, who are having less children. So the parents are having less children. So what's actually happening is the steepness or this idea of a straight line of population growth is actually starting to curve over because people are having less kids. Um, and it's just this idea that we always think when we see something going up and up and up that it's going to continue going up and up and up, or it's going to keep on the same trajectory that it's going right now. I mean, coronavirus could be a great example. Like it's not like a straight line, is it? The sort of cases aren't going up. It's exponential. But what I'm saying is the graph, right? Is the graph isn't a straight line. That's my point. It's kind of like it's curved, right? So nothing is almost straight. The straight line is almost an illusion that we use to try and simplify things that are complex.
But that's exactly it. It's like, with his poverty example, he said that generations, like after a generation, you normally move from one income level to another. I think he was saying. So this is done through like education. So educate, like an increase in education reduces poverty, which reduces the amount of children that people have. But obviously, there's a point at which, back extreme poverty, people are going to have more kids because there's child labor, and there's a higher mortality rate for them. Um, but as you start to move out of that, you still have a lot of kids, but realistically, the mortality rate goes down, and then when you get to a higher level, you only realize that you need to have like two kids, or like the average.
Yeah.
So it slowly like curves off, so it becomes an S curve, I think he
Mm-hmm.
talks about. But the fact is that the more points you have, the more accurate you can like see what the gradient is and how the curve is going to react. At the beginning of the coronavirus, it just kept increasing, and it's very easy to say like, fuck, this is just going to keep going until everyone in the world is going to have it. But realistically, those like the results have gone down now. So
I think for me, it's more like when you see a line, you got to understand what's actually contributing to the increase of the line.
yeah,
And what I mean, obviously, the world's way more complex, and just obviously there's like one or two factors that increase it, right? But it's just trying to understand the relationship between the things. So, for example, with the population, it's like the relationship is the reason why it's going up is because a lot of people in the level one of the income group or level two are having like 5 to 6, maybe even 8 kids. Um, and then obviously as you get sort of into the sort of income level four, which is the West, you're having 2 to 3 kids. And as these people transition from the 8 kids to the three, the population is obviously going to curve off and not get as steep. And it's just understanding the relationship behind the line rather than just seeing a line and going, okay, it's increasing.
yeah, yeah, no, exactly.
I think an interesting one with a straight line, it reminds me of the turkey illusion from Nassim Taleb. It's like this idea that for Thanksgiving, they're feeding a turkey every day. So the turkey would be plotting along on his graph, right? Every day I'm getting fed, blah, 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 blah,
Yeah.
blah, until the day he gets killed, right? And then it's gone. So yeah, we always assume, we always try and extrapolate. Um, I thought there was another really good example once as well about, I think it was like temperature and properties. Like for example, something melts, right? But if you looked on a graph and saw between 0 and 50 degrees, that thing wasn't melting. You could then assume that it's going to go on to 100. But once it hits its boiling point, it goes right. And it's back. This like the dosage thing. It's never a straight line. It's like once you get past a certain point, stuff changes.
Yeah.
Same with energy and heat. Think about it.
Yeah.
But that was the straight line. I quite like the destiny instinct. This idea that um, the destiny instinct is saying that innate characteristics determine the destinies of people. So this is kind of like an egotistical version of or way of seeing the world. It's like saying we in the West, we're so, or sorry, like the US in particular, like we're so entrepreneurial, we're so like self-independent that we're obviously always going to be the best country and we're always going to be the most like have the best economic growth. And then you could say something, I don't know what they'd say, but they'd say about other countries saying, oh, they have these characteristics and therefore they're never going to be like us.
Yeah.
Um,
But it's basically taking a pattern from the past and projecting it into the future. If you were powerful in the past, it gives you the illusion that you're going to be powerful in the future, which is exactly what the West does. It's very arrogant from that perspective. But it's the same. Like we do this with a lot of cultures. In terms of we see how they acted, and then we just assume that that's how it's going to continue for the rest of their like, well, for the future. Um, but the thing is that when we gather our patterns from like large events in the past, we don't look at the small little things. We look at the big changes, which normally are made up of smaller changes. So the problem is when we predict into the future, we predict big changes and we overlook all the gradual change. We don't look at the small little increases that a country might be doing. We just assume that it's not going to be doing very well, or we're going to assume that it's going to be doing great. But the thing is, we overlook all the gradual change.
yeah, for sure. I think the destiny instinct's almost an extension of stereotypes. Like the common stereotypes is like, right,
Oh yeah,
it's this idea that personality is relatively fixed, and like the characteristics of a nation are set.
Yeah,
I don't really understand how you can like characterize a nation when I think one of his main points as well is like the generalization instinct, right? I don't think we touched on this. It's like we take these characteristics and then we just project them onto everybody within that country. And
yeah,
it's like, well, no, there's more variation in that country than there is people of that generalization, if you kind of get me.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, you need to be more specific. Generalizing basically covers such a wide field of people or information, and then we generalize it rather than like breaking it down and being specific about it and actually like noticing their differences rather than only categorizing them on their similarities.
I'll tell you what a very dangerous sentence is this idea of that stereotypes are there for a reason. Because if you read this book and realize that people are so capable, or they're capable of change, right? Or that this destiny instinct doesn't exist almost. Stereotypes actually don't. They're in our mind rather than actually the person. If you kind of get me, stereotypes are just our way of dealing with an incomplete information on somebody. We need to fill in the gaps because we can't quite work them out. So we just use past information. But where do stereotypes come from? Fair enough, maybe in the past, right? This idea of like jocks in high school, right? There's like that classic, like any TV program you watch, there's always the jocks, it's the nerds and all this. It's not that clear cut. I've been to school, I've seen it. It's not the clear cut. There's jocks, there's nerds. But the problem is when you see that, but when you see that in media, right? You then start thinking using these terminology. I find it really interesting. And then you start judging people as like jocks and stuff, but in reality, that did they even exist, or is that just something that we conjured
Yeah.
up to just?
Was that just an archetype now?
It is just an archetype. Oh, these stereotypes. What these stereotypes come from is the they take an example of somebody who's similar to that and then they just make it extreme, if you kind of get me.
Yeah.
Like the jocks aren't actually like massive bullies and bully all the nerds. It's just like as you see in probably every single fucking like TV program, right? But they've just really extrapolated from the idea that because they're big and strong, maybe for example, they would be the ones who bully, right? And then what happens is that then it gets set in stone and people just view the world through that. So if you're in college in America and you watch a lot of TV and you see a lot of programs, you probably almost look through your new world through that lens.
Yeah. It's a constant cycle.
Can you imagine if in the media it was all about like, imagine the nerds were like the kings of the college because they could use, I don't know, do you get what I mean? If there was like a different
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
stereotype, would they be treated better in school? Interesting. I kind of off topic, but
I think it's because like these are more extreme examples, and so they're more memorable, and so that's how we just project all these people. If we assume if we met one jock in our life who was really stupid, okay, we would just assume that all jocks are stupid. That's like the sort of stereotype that we're filling in. It's the destiny. We're seeing their past pattern. This is the destiny instinct. We're seeing their past pattern of being stupid, and we just assume they're going to be stupid, and then we just project that onto every jock that we
for
meet.
sure. I think another an interesting parallel to what you're saying now is the same logic. So the idea of like, oh, because there's one jock that's like that, they're all like that, right? It's the same thing for this.
Yeah,
So if one chemical in a food is unsafe, then all chemicals are unsafe. That's kind of like the same logic.
yeah,
So
yeah,
would
yeah.
you be prepared to conclude that all chemicals are safe on the basis of one safe one? So like, how can you conclude that all jocks are the same when you've just seen one? And obviously, the ones that get your attention, like you said, are the ones that are the most different or the ones that stand out. But how can you use the standout characteristics to explain the majority? It doesn't make any sense. But
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's back down to a sort of innate desire to just categorize everything because we can't really function without trying to make sense of the world. Like if you went to school and you didn't have these archetypes of what the kids are or what your friends are, what their sort of role is in society, you wouldn't be able to function because you'd be probably taking in too much information. It's almost like it's almost a way of cutting off new information when you categorize. You're like, right, he's this person, right, done.
Yeah.
Now I don't have to think about anything he does.
Well, I think that leads quite nicely into his other instinct, the single perspective instinct, because his idea is that like you just said, we like to categorize things. If we have this gap of knowledge, we want to fill it so that we don't have to worry about it. But the thing is that leads us to assuming that there's like only one solution, or only one cause. It's a single perspective. There's only one thing that contributes to it. So if we have that outlook on the world, we overlook everything else. If we have one solution to something, we overlook all the other solutions that we could have looked at. Um,
Sure. The thing I think about the single perspective is almost like I, I did make a note on it. I'm trying to find it exactly, but roughly in my head, it's to do with basically if you're trained to do something or look at the world in a certain way, you look at it through that lens. Like if you're a mathematician, or a data scientist, you look at the world through data. Um, and like we all have our own perspective on things. And the problem is when you just have the people in charge or somebody who's trying to figure something out only looks at it from one perspective. It's kind of like what you would say the argument for like against capitalism is the idea that the stocks and the people at the head of the financial departments and the investment bankers are all trying to improve profitability. And when you just follow one number and measure one thing, you're missing out on the fact that it's actually people you're serving. And what then happens is you then either increase the cost of your product to customer dissatisfaction, or you cut costs, right? And you lose the company's ability to produce, I don't know, as efficiently, right? And it's just an idea that you should basically, in my head, use as many lenses on the one problem as possible to look at it as like multivariant in the sense that you don't, it's not, you just stop this idea of one thing causes one thing. One thing leads to another, because in reality, it's like a load of different things.
Yeah, there's multiple factors, and you end up overlooking them.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So it's the idea of looking at multiple variables to figure out what causes the problem, rather than just like,
Yeah.
oh, it's not quite as simple as, oh right, this one thing is causing all our issues. It's like, right, this impacts, this impacts, right? How can we sort of address these issues?
Yeah. And I think it does depend on where you're coming from or what you're looking for. And like it kind of relates to what we were talking about last week in terms of metaphors. You know, if you use a certain metaphor, you're looking for one thing, but you're hiding all the rest, or you're overlooking all the rest. And like which is basically confirmation bias. We're looking for things that we want to find, and then as soon as we find it, we just slot that in. But we overlook everything else in the process, which we want to stop. We want to be able to like take in as many solutions as possible and then assume which one's the best, or look
Yeah.
at all the causes and fix it that way.
Well, this is the quote, mate. I've just found it. So people with math skills get fixated on numbers. Climate activists, yeah, argue for solar everywhere. Physicians promote medical treatment where prevention would be better. Well, everybody has their innate biases for solutions based on the solution they provide. So his idea was combine ideas, compromise, solve problems on a case by case basis. And this idea of just not just looking at, so yes, you need the numbers to work out what's really going on. Yes, the argument for climate change, yes, you need solar, but solar everywhere isn't the answer, right? It's the same with physicians. Like, right, okay, treatment does work, but it only works when this person's really ill. Prevention is better the majority of the time. So let's stop focusing on your solutions,
Yeah.
because your solutions actually don't even treat the real problem, or they're only treating one aspect of it. Um, and it's just amazing how many people can't look at something from different perspectives. And it's always just like you just said, the single perspective instinct. Is it single perspective instinct? It is, isn't it? Yeah. It's this idea that you can't even just take a step back and go like, what if he weren't looking at it from this lens? What if he tried it from this lens? Like, so right, this is a number here. What if you think about the person behind this number? How do they feel? Like, how have they come into this? How have they come and found our company, for example? Maybe be a good example. But
But I think it does it. I see more and more that it links to like the Dunning Kruger effect. That you know, if you have only one solution to something, then it makes you more confident in it. If you had 10 solutions to something, your confidence in one would like reduce a lot. You know, and it's only by understanding those 10 that you become more confident and you can apply a better solution. You know, I think this leads in quite nicely to like the blame instinct as well, because if we have this sort of outlook on the world, this single cause, single solution to everything, then it's very easy to have a single person to blame or a single company to blame. And we see this all the time. How many times do we like accuse something of happening because of someone? As in, like, we choose one person to blame when realistically it was a number of factors. You know, when someone says, oh, this company did that, it's like, is it the company? Like, that is a fictitious belief. Like, that's a fictitious thing. Who in that company? And then, you know, there's so many other factors to it. But as soon as we find someone to blame, that's our answer. We slot that in, and we don't have to think about it anymore. We don't have to question anymore. It's just it basically. I said something here. When we find someone to blame, we create our own finish line. We cut ourselves early or close the loop, meaning we stop questioning and looking for any further truth. But yeah, you get my point.
yeah, no, for sure. I think I, for me, it reminds me of René Girard's mimetic theory, and he talks his idea of scapegoat. What we do as humans is we build up to this like social unrest crescendo, This is like big sort of social groups rather than just individuals, and then we end up finding a scapegoat, and then we kill them. Like for example, Jesus would be an example. But what it is we have this innate desire to find a closure point.
Yeah.
And I feel like this happens with a lot of relationships as well. Like this idea of closure, and that blame gives you closure. You
Yeah.
find who's responsible for something, and you kind of hang, like you hang them metaphorically, right? You lay them out to dry. You blame them. You've then ridiculed them. Their lives ruined. Now we move on. If you kind of get me, and it's kind of what social media promotes now. It's like this idea of something bad's happened. I can't explain it. I'm really confused. This is kind of what the madness of crowds talks about. We've lost meaning through religion, so we're now trying to find new meaning. And this new meaning is this idea like something bad's happened. We need to find somebody to blame. So we look for somebody to blame. Oh, this person said something I don't agree with. Therefore, he's like promoting what just happened. Right, he's going to be blamed. And yeah, then once, like you just said, once you've blamed somebody, the finish line has been reached.
Yeah.
Like you're then done thinking.
You create your own finish line.
Yes. Yes. I think it's just an idea of closure. And it's basically, if you remember flow, it's psychic entropy. So it's this idea that the brain likes to have closure on things. And it will find a way to close open loops. So this is open loops being like something in your head which is keeping you awake because you can't quite understand it, or you can't. You need to understand why that something
Yeah.
happened, so you have to finish it. And the easiest way, once again, is just to find somebody to blame and then say it's them, it's their fault, they're morally wrong, they're bad.
Like, think about how many bad tendencies we must have, or like, depending on our biases. Like, oh, we don't like a certain person, so we're going to blame it on that kind of person. This is an imperfect example of like Hitler, really, with like the Jews
Mhm.
just blaming everything on
This
them.
is me. Essentially, to me, is that yeah, it's the same thing. It's literally that taken to the extreme.
Yeah,
It's got to the point where everybody's turned around. Like I said to you, back to this René Girard scapegoating. Right, the whole country's now believed that the reason why they've been held back is because of one particular issue. For example, with them, it was the Jewish race, and like then like, do you know what I mean? Is everything's pinned on them, and then it becomes justifiable in terms of the eradication.
yeah,
Um, Obviously, it's not got this far in the world at the moment, but I just see it more and more now that people are so quick to blame,
yeah,
and they're so unwilling to like take a look in the mirror and be like, right, how can I contribute? How did I contribute to this? Like,
yeah,
by the way, it's not me saying people are contributing to societal issues, but I think on an individual basis in relationships, it's very easy to like blame your significant other or a friend for something, yet you play 50% of the role in that
yeah,
relationship and you should have said something. Like, it's
yeah,
like people who expect you to mind read them. They're like, oh, why didn't you care about me? I obviously showed you that I was upset. Well, no, I asked you if you were right and you said yes. It's like, I'm not put on this planet to mind read you. And if you blame me for not being attentive, maybe you should just take a look at yourself and being like, actually, did I make it clear or obvious?
yeah. It's quite interesting. I was watching this TV program called Years and Years, and it's kind of like Black Mirror, but a bit more realistic. And all these sort of things happen, and there's this woman who says, well, realistically, we're all to blame. We all bought that £1 t-shirt from Primark because it was only
Mhm.
£1. We didn't need a
Yeah,
t-shirt, but we bought it for £1. Even though we know that there are probably terrible circumstances in which they're being made, like sweatshops and
yeah,
child labor, those kinds of things. Yet we're aware of it, yet we play a part as well. But it's so easy to like put the blame off us and find someone to do it. I think it's like we don't want to feel guilty, and so we try and find someone else. And like finding someone to blame is kind of, it ends up being our goal. We end up focusing on that rather than the system at hand, rather than questioning the system and focusing. The same goes for like the opposite of blame is like praising someone. But normally
Mhm.
it's not because of just one person that did something. It wasn't just one hero. It wasn't just one person on the battlefield. It was every soldier. You know,
Ooh. The way you just, I think you just brought up a really interesting example of how like the blame also leads to our idea of heroism.
hmm,
Like we always try and find that one cause. Like we're like, oh wow, like Steve Jobs, great entrepreneur, but you forget that like there was a company and there's thousands of people in the company who helped produce the results. Right? It's never really like the blame. Like I guess the opposite of the blame is the idea of like putting somebody on a pedestal and sort of praising them as like a one man band, when in reality it's always way more complicated.
yeah, we overvalue them.
Yeah, of course. We overvalue the bad and we overvalue the good. Like as if there's one person to blame. You could argue with Hitler thing as well. This is probably touchy for most people. That at the end of the day, although he was mad, it wasn't just him. Everybody else would be complicit in
Oh
it. If
yeah,
you get
yeah,
me.
yeah, 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 yeah,
People, he's on the pedestal, but obviously other people for it were punished, etc. But what I mean is, he's the guy. He's the face. The thing is, we always need a face to make sense of a complicated reality.
yeah. Exactly. We need to simplify it. and it's much easier to have one person rather than 1,000 people in front of
Yeah. For example, like go on Twitter and social media, like the Americans are like one side's blaming Trump, one side's I don't know what. Do you know what I mean? But they're simplifying it down to just Trump. But it's not that simple. It's not just Trump that's causing all their issues. There's other stuff going on. I think what people do, people are so confused to what's going wrong that they need to find a way to blame something. And that's almost where that instinct comes in.
you. Yeah. I think that's like such a big point out of this whole book, that like, nothing's that simple. Nothing's ever so simple. There's complexity, and if you're going to make a decision about something, then you should look at the complexity. You can't just take in this knowledge that's been so simplified and everything else has been chucked out. I think to understand it, we need to understand the complexity.
Sure. Um, like, and that's the problem. I think one of the other things about this is it's just like I didn't. Was there one about attention as one of the instincts?
But there's an urgency instinct.
Okay, I guess you could argue that's slightly linked to attention, but this idea of like where you put your attention is like defines your reality. So like if you're paying attention to one thing happening in the world, your reality is defined by that, right? To a degree. Like if I'm thinking about all the injustice across the world, my mind is all about injustice and how the world isn't fair. But if I focus on maybe some all the fairness and love in the world, um, my reality is much nicer, right? It's just and the thing I think people really really struggle with, or the biggest realization for me is you actually get to choose what you pay attention to. Like if you really focus, you can choose what you pay attention to.
Yeah.
You can block out the stuff which isn't nice. And people could say I'm self-centered or mean for doing that, but in reality, you've got to take care of yourself, and then everything follows suit afterwards, right? And if you're in a constant fear-based set of mind, you're not going to be very productive or useful.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, I think lastly to touch on this like sort of urgency instinct, because I think this does play a big part in media, especially, is
Sure.
just this idea of, if you're a reporter once again and you need to make something sound more important than it actually is, urgency is a perfect way of getting through to us. It becomes, if something's affecting us now, it's a threat. Okay. Whereas if something, we can't really conceive what it's like for 50 years in the future.
So, what are you saying that we need things to be shown as more urgent, or are you
No,
saying
so
that
I'm saying that like things need to be put into perspective. Okay. So, the ice an ice cap won't melt in a day. Well, actually, I don't know. It probably could now, but
if you put it next to the sun, I'm sure it would melt pretty quickly.
yeah. But my point is that like this stuff isn't happening as urgent as people are saying it is. Um, it is, we need to act straight away. But the problem is that most people, when they can't see, the sea levels rising, then they're kind of blind to it, and so they turn a blind eye.
Yeah, yeah, and it's one of these things that um with the I don't know the media almost make things seem for me more urgent than they are. But stuff like coronavirus is very urgent, right?
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong, but they almost portray things as like needing change immediately, and it almost creates outrage. And then you almost this is kind of why I see why this protest happened at the moment. It's like everything becomes like this is an urgent problem, it needs to be solved like all the time. Like there's never they never could cover something and be like, oh right, okay, this could be changed over the next 5 years, because everybody wants stuff to be different now. And I think this idea of like back to his big point that over the time everything is getting better, but it just takes longer than you think. It's just we are inclined to want things to change immediately just because that's what, and that also living in the world we live in, right? Because we get things so easy, like you can go play video games and feel the sense of achievement and progress within minutes. We all feel like everything has to change quickly or should change quickly, and therefore everything that comes to us is always pitched to us as like an urgent thing that needs attention. But in reality, everything's kind of unurgent, really. Um, but I feel that's just human wiring, right? It's kind of like we pay attention to things, or we are wired to try and figure out what's urgent to us, and obviously what is urgent is stuff that stimulates the am I getting it wrong here? It's not the hippocampus, is it?
It's the
Is the
amygdala.
hippocampus amygdala? Sorry, yeah, you got yeah. In terms of goes straight into the limbic system, straight into the fight and flight response.
Yeah.
Um, I think what's really interesting, and this is kind of off topic from Factfulness, is this idea that what I think Rory Sutherland was saying the other day, that like business and the way the world is set up is just one big social experiment, and that through looking at what works and what's successful, you can learn a lot about human nature. And I think particularly this book's quite good at sort of picking out like the fact that we're all so skewed in our worldviews shows that our biological wiring is stopping us from seeing the bigger picture, if you kind of get me.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
it's this idea of what these instincts and how the media manipulates us. The fact the media still exists in the way it does, and what gets shown shows because they know what works, right? They know what gets attention. Otherwise, they wouldn't still be in business. So it just goes to show how hardwired some of these desires and instincts and sort of shortcuts are in the brain. And I just find it super interesting just to look at the what's being portrayed, what's being shown,
Yeah.
because it just reveals so much about us as humans.
Yeah. Like I think in realistically, what would be nicer is if people did when reporting, they were kind of obligated to um, you know show the whole picture, not just certain aspects, or actually try to trigger all of us. There's no, obviously like good news realistically doesn't get published anywhere near as much as bad news. We want to be aware of what's happening and if anything's like a threat to us. But I think it should be put into perspective of the whole thing, like like I said, the whole picture, rather than just a fraction of it to like trigger us. Like I think we should all learn what this book has to say, because I think it's super important, especially when like a crisis like this. It's very easy to get led astray, and think it's the apocalypse, the world is ending, when realistically it's not. Um, but yeah, I think both sides need to learn it, and definitely the media needs to take on board like putting things in perspective.
Yeah, no, for sure. Do you know what? Let's just try and recap. I think for me, the biggest thing about all of this, right, is actually the big takeaway is just put things in perspective. Like that is literally the one sentence that can sum this up. Because it's same with the gap instinct. It's the same with all of it, really. It's like, right, there's a gap. Put it in perspective. What is that gap? What
Yeah,
gap are they trying to show? Right? It's the same with the size instinct. They're giving you a big number. Put it into perspective. What does this relate to? What's this about? The fear instinct, the negativity instinct. Okay, right, we're being shown all this information. Let's put it into perspective. Is that actually relevant to my life? What else do we have? We've got the generalization instinct. Once again, put it in perspective. Oh, we think these people are so different, but are they different? It's just, like, do you know what? You're just changing the frame. The way I see perspective is just changing the way you look at something.
yeah, exactly.
Um, the destiny instinct, the same thing. Change your perspective. Like, is it innate characteristics that make up a nation, or is it actually the more the sort of the environment or the technological advancements in a society, right? That changes it, right? Blame instinct, same thing. Put it in perspective. Is this person really meant to be blamed? Um, basically, though, I think the main takeaway is just try think more.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the biggest thing. Like, the fact that this is an instinct means it's impulsive. It's, a reaction from our amygdala, our limbic system. But what we should learn to try and do is just stop, take a breath, and think about it. Look at the complexity, be more specific about it, or look for the specifics. And that way, you can already, in a calm manner, you can assess whether something is a threat or not, or whether what the media is like reporting is a threat or not. But I think, yeah, we have to, like, the opposite of instinctual, like, we need to be rational.
I think one of the biggest things I've taken away from this as well is how wrong we can be systematically about our whole entire worldview. Like,
Mm,
and then also how we need to update our categories regularly. Or update our knowledge fairly. Like, for example, if you're going to have an opinion on a big societal issue, you need to have the most up to date facts and knowledge, and you also need to be able to compare it to the past. Because although there's a big problem today, it doesn't mean it's not being improved every year, year on year. And I think people forget that. And once again, you're not just going to eradicate like world poverty, right? It's not just going to be like, okay, overnight, right? We've solved it. Okay, this is a freaking complicated issue that people have been spending eternity trying to solve. And you think now that you've gone to university and got a degree in social sciences that you've figured it all out? Go, yeah, fair
yeah.
play.
But think about how outdated these like textbooks and everything are. Like realistically, like technology is a perfect example because it's such a progressive like area. It's changing almost every time. I think there was like something to do with, is it architecture or coding, and it's like as soon as they've done their 3-year course, there's a whole new like way of doing it.
Like what you,
But the thing is, it's constantly like it constantly needs to be updated. So
of
we need
course,
to be aware of that, because probably the things that we learned at school are no longer as relevant.
of course, and like once again. I thought, okay, this is another interesting. I don't know if this was in Factfulness. I think it was. Anyway, it's about Vietnam War, and it was this idea that obviously the US called it the Vietnam War, and the US and the Vietnam called it the American Resistance War, and that for me just exemplifies as well. Not even only school is just distorted, or your education is distorted to your country's view of the world.
Yeah.
If you
Yeah,
kind of
no,
get me.
exactly.
That made me just realize I have systematic errors because my country wants me to believe that the UK, for example, where we are, is like we are the best country, or we were always wrong done by Europe, or we were always like the victims and we retaliated, when in reality it could have been us being aggressive, right? And we always seem to, yeah, it's one of those things that you that's another perspective taking is like, why is this actually the truth, or is this just a spin that our country tells us to get us a bit more patriotic? Um, but yeah, I think one of the things you could almost take away and leave on with this book was the step by step, year by year, the world is improving. Not on every single measure, every single year, but as a rule, though the world faces huge challenges, we have made tremendous progress. This is a fact-based worldview, and I love that. I think it's powerful. It's like so much. We think there's so much wrong with the world, and to be fair, especially right now, that's like the argument is everything's falling apart, right? But when has everything not been falling apart? I feel like every year there's something that's falling apart. It just depends where you're deploying your attention.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's it, mate. I think that's a wrap.
Yeah, I think that's it.
Cool.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that, guys. If you did, make sure you leave a comment or a review. And if you want to know more about what we do, or you want to read any of our book summaries, head on over to wisewords.blog. And if you feel like staying wise throughout the week, why not follow us on Instagram at wisewordsummaries? I guarantee you'll love what you see. Anyway, guys, until next time, have a good one.